Putin remains determined to bring Ukraine to its knees militarily. And he is betting that international support for Ukraine will wane. I will advocate sustainable, reliable financial support for Ukraine in the coming years, because it's about the security of Europe.
Well, that was the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, once again pledging support for Ukraine. And Kyiv needs that reassurance as Western money and Western weapons start running low. A budget crisis in Germany has complicated its commitment to funding Ukraine's fight against Russia. This as another barrage of Russian missiles targeted the Ukrainian capital today, reportedly wounding dozens of people. German-made air defense systems are increasingly vital to protecting Ukrainian cities, and the German Chancellor is adamant that weapons deliveries will continue. Well, as we heard, Chancellor Scholz also plans to push for sustainable long-term support for Ukraine at a summit of EU leaders in Brussels this week. Ukraine's President, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, is expected to attend those talks as he presses Western allies for more military assistance. On Tuesday, he was in Washington hoping to unblock $61 billion in funding being held up in Congress. Both he and US President Joe Biden warned that weakening of international will would only benefit Russia.
It's very important that by the end of this year, we can send a very strong signal of our unity to the aggressor and the unity of Ukraine, America, Europe, the entire free world.
But without supplemental funding, we're rapidly coming to an end of our ability to help Ukraine respond to the urgent operational demands that it has. Putin is banking on the United States failing to deliver for Ukraine. We must prove him wrong.
Let's go through this then with Marina Miron, who's a military analyst at King's College London. Welcome back to DW, Marina. How desperately does Ukraine need extra funding and support from its allies right now?
Good evening, Phil. I think at this moment, Ukraine needs it more than ever because Ukrainian military is running out of artillery shells, and I'm referring to 155-millimeter artillery shells. It also needs heavier equipment such as tanks. It needs air power, obviously, so the F-16s at least. It needs more missiles. It needs more air defenses. And now we're seeing after the counteroffensive, after the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which didn't yield the expected results, the Russians are continuing with offensive operations around Avdiivka, around Kupiansk. So Ukraine needs at least to be able to halt the Russian progress on the battlefield. And so Western aid, the US aid, and the aid from Europe is critical at the moment.
Right. Do we need to tease out some of those reasons, though? Because you talked about Ukraine being in need of shells and tanks. Lots of those have already been promised, has it? That seems to be less a money issue than a supply issue, that Europe can't seem to manufacture them quickly enough.
That is absolutely correct, because right now the European countries have understood what the exigencies of war in Ukraine are. And this rests with the defense manufacturers, because the global supply chain is very volatile right now. And in order to manufacture tanks, we have to get materials, we have to get steel, we have to get aluminum, we have to get lithium. And shall we remember that Russia is a huge supplier of steel. So those components, those raw materials rise in price, making them more expensive to procure, taking longer time to arrive. Therefore, in order to manufacture those tanks that Ukraine needs, it will take time. And therefore, this is the time that Ukraine doesn't have, and therein lies a problem.
And so how big a problem is that? Can Ukraine hold its current positions without a change in these supply lines?
Well, it will depend. It's very difficult to predict the future and what might happen on the battlefield in military terms. And of course, politics will also influence that. However, it doesn't look very promising for Ukraine, especially as I said, as the Russians are deploying, again, the Wagner troops around Bakhmut. They are trying to push and to get hold of Avdiivka with little regard to Russian casualties. And that is a problem because Ukraine also has a mobilization potential issue as well. So manpower is also scarce in Ukraine, and how long it can hold on without any provisions or with little provisions remains to be seen, but the future is not very promising.
So a closer look at those figures. We heard today from US intelligence that who are claiming 315,000 Russians have been killed and wounded since the start of this invasion 22 months ago, which sounds like a very high human cost. Do those figures sound about right to you?
Well, I was very surprised about this release because we have to understand why is it being released now and who is the target audience of these figures. What I'm trying to say is the losses on the Russian side have been colossal. However, there are other estimates also coming from the US from May 23, which were estimating 50,000. These estimates coincided with some other estimates made by the likes of Mediazone, and therefore I cannot imagine how since then the number would have grown to 300,000 because we're talking about 6-7 months. During these months, the Russians have not conducted any serious large-scale offensive operations. So it seems like the estimate is overstated.
Right. So we presume that's an overstatement then, because my next question is why is Russia losing so many troops? But it sounds like, well, you can't really answer that because the actual numbers are so foggy.
Yes, absolutely. I think the release of that statement is somehow to demoralize the Russians, maybe those who will be reading this, because I think, again, this figure is not accurate. And we would need to compare figures from different sources to get a more or less accurate estimate. That being said, what this report has said, that it's almost the military strength that the Russians had pre-invasion, indicating something about Russia's future military capability. And I just wanted to caution that those figures, the quantitative data is not the only determining factor for Russia's military capability. So we have to be careful when interpreting those numbers.
Yeah, so how do you interpret those numbers then? Looking forward, with severe losses, all right, we can't be completely accurate about them, but the implication from this intelligence was that the modernization of Russia's military has been set back something like 15 years. What do you think?
Well, I think that these are just two factors, and I think we cannot really predict Russia's military capabilities based on those two estimates. We still have to remember that even conservative estimates say that Russia can produce up to 500 tanks of various types a year, which is more than the US can produce currently. Right. So even taken in numbers, Russia retains still a huge capability. The problem is non-tangible factors such as leadership, morale, command and control, logistics, corruption, and Russia has all those problems. And so in order to be able to predict how Russia will behave militarily, we need experts from different disciplines, combining all those findings in order to get an idea. And even then, it depends also in which scenario, who will be the enemy. Are we talking about the Russians possibly in the high north, in the Arctic? Are we talking about them in Ukraine? Are we talking about them in Syria? So I think we have to be very careful when looking at those numbers and at those conclusions and estimates, because context matters. And of course, the policy matters and the strategy and how Russia will use its military power to achieve whatever political objective it will have.
Understood and clear as ever. Thank you so much for walking us through that. Marina Miron from King's College London. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.